Hi everybody, it's Connie again in Kathmandu, Nepal. One aspect of learning Tibetan that's especially difficult for beginners is that the language is pronounced differently depending on the region where it's spoken. There are dozens of different Tibetan dialects, some of which are so different from each other that they're mutually unintelligible. A person from Lhasa, for example, would have a really difficult time communicating with a person from Amdo. In spite of these sometimes drastic differences in pronunciation, the written form of the language is the same. Now, this is good news for those of you who are studying classical Tibetan, since the classical form of the language is usually written down and not used for everyday conversation. For those of you who are preparing to study colloquial Tibetan, be prepared for the fact that your pronunciation of letters and syllables can differ significantly based on the area that a Tibetan speaker comes from. But just to give you some familiarity with this issue, let's go through some of the general features of different dialects. In general, the way that Ladakhi is pronounced is probably the closest to the way that Tibetan used to be pronounced when classical Tibetan grammar was developed. This is because Ladakhi pronounces many of the letters that remain silent in other Tibetan dialects. Because so many of the letters are pronounced, and because so much of the vocabulary is different, Ladakhi is often considered a different language than Tibetan. Central Tibetan, sometimes referred to as Lhasa Khe or Lhasa speech, is what's generally spoken in central Tibet, in and around Lhasa. This is the sort of dialect that you'll generally hear on news broadcasts. In the Kham region of eastern Tibet, the dialect is generally referred to as Kham Khe, and while it sounds different from other forms of Tibetan, it can generally be understood by people from central Tibet. Amdo Khe, on the other hand, spoken in the Amdo region of Tibet, can sometimes differ so much that it can't be understood at all by people familiar with other Tibetan dialects. Now, in addition to these basic variations in dialects, there are also dozens of sub-dialects depending on the village in which Tibetan is spoken. And if that wasn't enough, Tibetan dialects also differ among exile communities. So the Tibetan that's spoken in Kathmandu is different than the Tibetan that's spoken in South India. And both of these are different than the Tibetan that's spoken in, say, the United States. Now, these variations in dialects can be tricky for beginners, which is part of why we're not focusing too intensely on pronunciation in this course. Working with and being corrected by a native Tibetan speaker is the best way to learn how to pronounce Tibetan properly, or at least in one of the many proper ways. As you're learning the alphabet, make sure to drill the material covered in this course and listen to the examples of the words and syllables being spelled and pronounced by native Tibetan speakers. Be patient with yourself and keep in mind that when you begin to speak with native Tibetan speakers, your pronunciation will be corrected, and it will be corrected based on the particular dialect that that person speaks.